Good afternoon. This is Francesco Barbera with Barbera Corporate Law, and I'm here with Scott Woodhill, the Director of Talent Optimization at Adroit Business Solution. And it's good to have you back, Scott. We had a great initial conversation around the subject of helping strong technical performers transition successfully into the role of management and leadership. And you had some very insightful and helpful observations to share with entrepreneurs about helping with that transition and the role they have to play in that process. So it's good to have you back, and both of us kind of talked offline and decided that it would be good to kind of look a little bit farther upstream, right, to the hiring process and improvements, sort of some common blind spots that many companies and entrepreneurs are bring into the hiring process, obviously inadvertently, and some of the adverse outcomes that result from those blind spots. And we really want to hear your wisdom and experience about improvements that can be made to the hiring process kind of at various stages of the life cycle. So improvements at the earliest stages where, right now, where maybe founders are just simply relying on a resume and an interview, right? And then improvements later on as companies are scaling and they need to ensure that they're vetting and generating a pipeline of really qualified candidates that are a good fit both technically and culturally, and that they're supporting founders in not only in getting things done, but in getting things done in the context of a culture that supports where the company is going, right? So
yeah.
So Scott, maybe we can begin with you talking about what you see are some real common blind spots in the hiring process, or flaws or opportunities for improvements, and kind of what, because of those blind spots, what you see in terms of the kind of issues that companies face with their talent.
Sure. So first, just to put a context on all of this, typically, traditionally, and still now, employers tend to hire based on experience, which they should, but mostly experience, and then how they feel in person with that person. Do they like them? Do they think they'll be a cultural fit? But when employers let go of people, it's often based on behaviors, something that they weren't, or mostly weren't, interviewed on in the first place. Likewise, when people join a company or an organization, they're joining because they want to do the work, they like the company, but typically they end up leaving because of a personality conflict with a boss. So that's something to keep in mind when hiring. It's so important to think about the fit and about the personality and behavioral traits of this person and how those fit with the job and with the culture. So traditionally, the focus was pretty much on experience. So looking over the resume, which, as we all know, people tend to embellish a little bit. Some lie, but most people just embellish somewhat. So it's not egregious. But just going on that and the feeling that you get from someone, some people interview really well. Does that mean they're a good performer? There's no correlation. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. So I think the easy answer is traditionally there wasn't a more holistic focus. And I think a lot of employers still now, it's getting better, but it's still relying heavily on, do you meet these check boxes rather than how well do you fit?
Yeah, that's real interesting. The observation about that when employees are let go, it's for behavioral issues that were never screened for, right? So, can you give a couple of examples of what you mean by that?
Sure. So oftentimes, some people just have difficult personalities, and that's something that may or may not be easy to screen for in an interview. But what we'll talk about is the more common thing when someone is not getting their needs met in either the work or the environment that they're in. Then the behaviors come out of either like lethargy and detachment, certainly disengagement, sometimes active disengagement, where they even are enrolling other people in their disengagement, talking about a boss, talking about, can you believe the company, this, that, finding other people to, just to discuss the things that they don't like when they're that disengaged. I think that's probably the, disengagement and active disengagement are both the biggest problems. When someone's disengaged, they're not productive. They're maybe doing the least they can do and just clocking in, clocking out at that point for the paycheck. That's definitely.
And as you pointed out, that's disengagement is kind of symptomatic of something that's going on behind the scenes. What you referenced, needs not being met, and maybe there are unspoken needs that the employees has varying degrees of awareness around that. But either way, it's something that was unanticipated and not discovered earlier on in the process. So it comes and
That's right.
grows into a problem that kind of can spread out into the culture unless it's contained. So
yeah, and look, well, I just will add that typically for the first 3 to 6 months, you're going to get the best performance from someone, regardless of that fit, regardless of the needs being met, because they could be excited. Certainly, they want to make a good impression. They want to show that the company made the right move by bringing them on board. But then the reality sets in after that number of months. And that's something that we have to be way more intentional about in that hiring process to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, I would say something like my initial response is, well, how could you screen for that?
Yeah.
Like, do you bring a crystal ball into the interview suite?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear your answer to that. In your experience, what works for anticipating those kinds of behavioral issues in the hiring process? Because I don't think either party wants those issues to arise, right? I mean, it's kind of an unhappy state for everyone. So clearly, on both sides, there's blind spots happening in the hiring process. So how do we make it better?
First, I'll talk about one that has little to do with hiring, but it's so important that it has to be mentioned, and that is being aware of the existing culture and environment and how that is affecting current employees and how it can affect incoming employees. So for example, if there's let's say a manager with a very strong personality, maybe it works for some people, maybe it works for few people. That's something that has to be taken into account. If that manager produces really well and does a great job, but drives employees away, that's something that outside of hiring has to be considered on dealing with. But since we're talking about hiring, if you have someone like that and you're bringing someone new in that will be managed by that person, that certainly has to be, the questions and what you're trying to find out about the person and let them know about their job. Somehow that has to be part of it. Otherwise, you're really risking having to look for another person for that role, 6 months down the line. But I think more focus on what is our culture, what do we want from a new person coming in? Do we want them to fit in and adopt the culture? Do we want them to synergize and change the culture into something better? Or do we really just want to find someone who's behaviorally the right fit with what we've got going on and not be disengaged? You have to discern that for yourself, because not every company has a defined culture. And that can be okay, but you have to have awareness about that as you're checking the fit of someone coming in. And I'll just say one more thing about that, especially when it comes to millennials. So it's a generalization, not everyone is the same, but one thing that's a broad characteristic of millennials is that they want more purpose in what they're doing. So it's important to them that they are part of something. And it could just be part of the culture, being on a team doing important work, or a team that really supports each other. But being part of something for that generation it's very important to them.
Okay. Well, you've said a lot there. I would love to try to break it down a little bit. So, when I'm considering what is my culture and how do I figure out if what role a new person will play in my culture, part of me thinks, well, I just really want a positive person who does a good job and is enthusiastic. Like what else is there to the equation besides that?
So without I guess the things to look at are, is the team dynamic important, or is it important that this person is able to work on his or her own and then report to or sometimes work with other people? So how much teamwork is there? How much do they need to be getting along with other people? How much support is there? Do people, even if it's not their job, do they go and help others in the organization? Is helping people part of the culture? Do you go out and do volunteer work as an organization? Anything that's part of I guess all of that's considered culture for any organization. How does this person fit into that? Some people might be great at whatever type of work you're looking for, but they work better on their own. And it's not that they, are bad with other people in any kind of way, just that it'll be hard for them to constantly be working with other people if that's not getting a need met for them,
Okay.
Going against their default.
I understand. I think I'm getting it. So what I'm hearing is, it's culture, as you're describing it, is the way we do things around here, and what it's going to be like to work here on a day-to-day basis. So it's not just, this is the job that you're going to be doing, but this is the environment in which you'll be doing it. And rather than focusing on just the job, what you're saying now, Scott, is think about that other component of the environment that they're going to be in, the how that the job is going to be done, and with who, and what are the routines and cultural practices that they're going to be a part of, so that you could bring that into the interview process, bring that into the conversation, and really I can see that in bringing it to the conversation, there will be a mutual evaluation, like on the candidate's part, how does that sound to me? Am I going to be comfortable? Does that sound exciting and interesting and something I look forward to? Or, oh geez, that's not going to work too well with my personality. And so I could see that bringing that into the hiring process would generate a lot more information for sure.
It's true. And sometimes, again, since people tend to put their best foot forward in interviews,
right.
It's important to ask open-ended questions and about past experience. So, for example, if it's part of your culture that people don't just work 9 to 5, like they work as late as they need to work, and that's a very big part of that organization's culture. Asking the person, so in past jobs, what are some situations you've been in where you've had to stay late, or what do you do when it's time to go and you aren't done with your project? So not yes or no questions like, are you willing to stay late? Yes, because I want to put my best foot forward, so I'll say yes to whatever. What are some examples of, or what have you done when you wanted to go or needed to go, but there was something that needed to get done? And that way you're getting them out of their, best foot forward thinking, and they're really having to think, oh, examples, let's see. Unless they BS you, which at that point is pretty unlikely. You're going to get some really good information on how well they fit into that part of your culture.
Oh, that's very helpful. So it's number one, kind of internally, kind of taking an inventory of culture, and then formulating some open-ended questions that will facilitate a kind of natural and revealing dialogue about culture fit, without being so on the nose about it that people can fudge.
Yeah, I'd say that's it.
That is, you know why I like that so much is because it sounds so obvious in retrospect, and I can see that I don't really think I've ever done that.
It's okay. Until most things that I know, until I heard them, I had exactly the same reaction. It's like, well, of course, that makes total sense, but it's not. We've got so many things going on already in our job, in our own role, that when we go to interview someone, unless you just naturally are great at thinking of all the different aspects of it, which very, very few people are, you have to learn everything.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think this is so. Let's take it from. All right, that helps me conduct a better interview and plan a lot better, right? So, you talked about the importance of the fit between the candidate and the person that person will be working with eventually, and I guess what I'd like to hear about is it helpful to have multiple people interviewing a candidate, and if so, how do you manage that process in a way that produces the best outcomes?
I think the best answer is, so the most important factor is that it's a structured interview. But typically, you're not just interviewing one person, you're interviewing multiple people.
Right.
And let's say you interview one person one day and another the next day, sometimes we have a bad day, and that has us at a disadvantage emotionally. So asking the same questions, or at least having a baseline of set questions that you're asking each candidate, so that their answers can be compared regardless of how many people do interviewing, that is very important. I'll share a quick story. Just yesterday, I was talking to an associate of mine who's leaving one company and he's being interviewed at another company. He had completed his 8th interview last week with the company he's trying to get into. And he said that he thought that meeting with 8 different people, that since it's gone that far, that they would have something different to ask him, but apparently they're not. They're kind of asking some of the same questions, that it's not organized or structured. So he's wondering, are they even talking to each other, or are they just kind of giving a thumbs up or thumbs down, each of them? And why? So obviously the person who is going to be the person's boss should probably be one of the interviewers, maybe an HR person. It depends on how big your organization is and how many people this person will be working with. The position that my associate is going for is Director of Organizational Development for a fairly large company with thousands of employees. So it kind of makes sense that there will be more interviews, but it doesn't sound like they have the structure in place so that each one is done very intentionally with results that they can compare to different candidates, or about different candidates that have applied and gone through those interviews. So it really depends, what kind of role you're looking for. If you're looking for a higher position, you probably do want, not just for the sake of doing it, but you probably want at least 2 or 3 key stakeholders involved in the interview process. It doesn't just have to be people above the person either. It could be someone who will be reporting to that person, but to get their, if they're a high performer, how are they going to continue to do their job well with each of the candidates? So having them be at least part of the interview process. I felt like that was maybe a little all over the place. Did that make sense?
It does, yeah. I mean, just to summarize, the key point that you're raising is that in certainly that in certain positions, particularly more senior positions, it will make a lot of sense to have more stakeholders involved in the hiring process. But in those circumstances, to make that process most effective, you want to generate data that is reliable. And doing that means having at least some portion of the interview process be consistent across the board, so that people are comparing apples to apples when they're coming together and evaluating the candidate and comparing that candidate against other candidates. Sort of screen out to the extent possible the role of bad memory, subjectivity, people having a bad day. You need to have some hedge against that. And I mean, my desire or tendency when I do interviews is to really have a free-ranging conversation, and I would find it difficult and maybe a little uncomfortable to have a structured kind of process. Do you encounter that a lot in your work? Resistance to it?
Not a ton, but some people are so in their decision-making process, they're so gut-based as opposed to data-based, and that's okay. And it's okay to resist it. It doesn't mean that you have to go all structured if you've been successful relying on what your gut tells you about people and about their responses. But so maybe you just include some structure. What is it that is important to you from each of the candidates? Right. Certainly, the answers aren't going to be things like, well, how it feels that day to me about their responses. There are some things you will be able to come up with, even if that's important to you to have that flowing conversation with them.
Yeah. Yeah, like, so what are examples of, say, questions that, you can ask the same candidate over and over again, the same question, and it would produce kind of data that you could, responses that you could compare uh, across multiple candidates?
It's so role specific. I'm sure I could think of something though.
That's probably not.
Well, let's no, I mean, let's think of a good culture one then. So, if you if it's important to your organization and to the others, so people who are already doing whatever they have to do to get the job done, even if that means doing some, taking extra hours in the evening to stay and get it done, having that be a question that's asked, whatever the question is about that, having that be one of the first questions. Hey, look, I'm just going to tell you about the organization. Here is part of what we do. What are some examples? And then you ask that question that you want to ask about what have you done when there's something that hadn't been finished, but it was time for you to leave. Having something, I think that would probably be a good example about what you could ask each person.
Yeah, that's helpful. Good. So so now taking this, Scott, and like I'd love to hear a little bit about like when a company begins to grow and scale, and they have more resources and more of a need to have a systematic, successful hiring process, where filling roles on a timeline really makes a difference and an impact on the bottom line, and and then they have the resources to invest in the hiring process. Like, what, as a company grows, do you work with companies on in terms of implementing like systems, tools, processes to build out the hiring function in a way that is produces good outcomes at more scale, at greater scale?
So as they're looking already for behavioral traits and the needs being met of the candidates by the role that they're doing, as they're scaling and have more resources to do so, it could make sense to have a system in place that helps with that. And I know that we don't work with any of these ourselves, but there are HR information systems that can be used to help with the hiring process and some of the onboarding, keeping track of candidates and keeping track like that. Right. Once an organization has, let's say, 20 or more people working there and they're growing, one that we do work with is the predictive index, which is an assessment tool. It shows what people's drives and needs are, and then plugs it into the needs and drives that are associated with the role and what behaviors are needed for that role. So for example, if it's a data analyst position, then if they're really high in extroversion, that could be pretty tough unless it's kind of a unicorn data analyst position where they're constantly interacting with other people. Typically, they're doing a lot of solo work. You're going to want someone who likes to do that. So there are only 4 factors, extroversion being one of them. If they're low in extroversion, that's going to be perfect for a data analysis job. But any system like that that helps simplify the process and simplify just, having the information of what someone's default drives and needs are and what's called for by the job, and just having that match up. Mm-hmm. The one we use does that graphically and then has onboarding and team building and stuff beyond that. But for hiring, it's just one tool that makes it easier to match people up behaviorally to the roles that they're going for.
So there's the assessment tool. So yours is the predictive index, and then is that something that you share with the candidate and have a shared discussion about it, or does it tend to be internally focused, that conversation?
It's a different answer for different organizations. So you have every applicant, you give every applicant the link to take the assessment. It's only a 5-minute thing, so it's not a big burden. But some organizations do a read back with them and tell them what their profile says about them as part of the interview process. Other ones don't, and they keep it internal, like you suggested, and only tell them about it as part of the onboarding process. Because once you do that, you're also able to say, and your boss is this profile, and here's how the system suggests the two of you communicate effectively together, and here's how you overcome differences and that kind of thing. But it's really up to the organization how much you want to share. Of course, it'll take more time if you explain to each person you decide to interview about their profile. On the other hand, you're probably going to be interviewing fewer people because you'll already see the ones who are big outliers behaviorally from the role, and that probably won't be happy for very long in that role, and therefore you won't be happy with their performance for very long.
Yeah, so it acts as kind of a screening mechanism of the outliers, and then within the people that generally fit the parameters, it's an additional data point that is, you could say it's somewhat more objective, right? It doesn't come from the interviewer's observations. There's an objective basis in it. It sort of adds another layer of consistency and objectivity to and also thoroughness, I imagine, to the evaluation process. Do you need to have expertise to evaluate these results?
The answer is yes, you really do. If you're going to use it for something important like hiring, especially because there's always the, you have to be EEOC compliant in how you do that. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to risk. So,
in other words, you have to.
I would say.
Yeah, you have to be careful about bias entering the process, unconscious.
Yes.
Right.
That's right. So you have to be careful about bias, and that also means you definitely need to have consistency on how you do it. So either you have everyone take the assessment, or you have no one do it. You give everyone the results as they come in for their interview, or nobody. So consistency is the important thing there. And some tools should not be used for hiring at all. And I think they let you know themselves which ones should or should not.
That's interesting. So then in addition to assessments, which, I could see, it's obvious that, having, I could see the value that having that additional data might play in the process. Are there other tools or processes that you find to be to add a lot of value to the hiring process?
I just don't have enough expertise in them, but as I mentioned, the HR information systems, I do know that they exist that help facilitate that whole process and automate really the process a lot more for organizations.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I want to thank you, Scott. I think this has been a very helpful conversation and very actionable to, I know, a lot of my clients who are, in many cases, they're when they're below that 20-person threshold, they have both fewer resources to bring to the hiring process, but also every decision is so consequential. You know, that in those early stages, each hire has the potential to make such a big impact. And at the same time, when the fit is bad, the impact can also be quite great. Uh, so it's this sort of situation where the stakes are higher, but most of the people, uh, I think it's very easy to just use the uh, kind of gut instinct hiring approach as well. So the guidance that you've brought into how to make that process a little bit more comprehensive to generate more useful information um, is gonna, I think, make a difference. So thank you.
Well, I hope so, and you're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, and we'll post more information about how you guys can contact Scott for more follow-up questions about this work and the hiring process and the assessment tool, the predictive index that he referenced as well. So thanks again, Scott. Talk to you soon. Have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.
All right. See ya.